Our reading is from the book of Exodus, chapter 3, from verse 1 to 22. And I'll invite us to read together. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that the bush was on fire and it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am God of your father, God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face, because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them, hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land into a good, spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now the cry of Israelites has reached me. I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Go assemble the elders of Israel, say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you, and I have seen what has been done to you in Egypt, and I have promised to bring you out of the misery in the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go.
Please be seated. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pastor Malika. Thank you, Kisima, Karura Voices. Like I told you last Sunday, we shall be taking a survey again in the course of this year, just to find out the time for the services that works for you, how long you'd like the services to be. So be thinking through that as you prepare. For those of you who are visiting with us, we are studying the book of Exodus. We've looked at chapter 1. Last week we looked at chapter 2. We did not complete it. So I'll be looking a little bit at chapter 2 today and then a bit of chapter 3. And for those who take notes, I have a sermon outline. We have the providence of God, the presence of God, the call of God, and the name of God. Our sermon is titled Ebenezer because we are celebrating 30 years as a church and we are telling God, thank you. And when you look at Exodus, Moses is looking back and looking at what God has done up to the time that he begins to write this story. But we're also saying engage because Ebenezer is just the beginning. God is calling us because he's already brought us this far. He's calling us to greater things. And so he's calling us to engage. And so when we looked at chapter 2, or when we began to look at chapter 2, we began to see the engagement of God's people in God's purposes. Moses himself, writing the book of Genesis chapter 15, all the way from verse 12 to verse 16. In Genesis chapter 15, Abraham is growing old and he's making his plans for death and who will inherit his property. And so in his plans, the person who will inherit his property is his chief servant. And when God calls him and he tells him, look, I'll still give you a son. God said, Abraham tells him, well, my servant is here and he will inherit everything I have. And God tells him, no, I will give you a son. And Abraham cannot see the possibility because he's grown old, his wife is old, and he does not see how this will happen. And so God makes a covenant with Abraham. He tells him to slaughter certain animals, and God comes and passes between those animals in Genesis chapter 15. It is written like this in verse 12. It says, as the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. This was hundreds of years before this time that Moses is writing. God had already told Abraham the things that will happen. He will give him a son, and this son will have other children, and the descendants will be many. But they will be enslaved for 400 years in a strange country. But God will come for them because he will punish the nation that they serve as slaves, and they will come out with great possessions. And then in the 4th generation, that is when he's going to release these people. Why? He says, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. God has a purpose in all this. And so when your life and when the life of the Israelites is looking very miserable, it's looking all confused, God is fully in charge of what exactly is happening. And you know, sometimes you and I, when things are falling apart, when life is looking as if it's upside down, it is very easy for us to think that also God is falling upside down, or God is falling apart just because things are not working for us. Or it is easy to think that God is not even aware of the things that are happening to our lives. But God knows. And it is because of this that this word of what exactly was going to happen, God didn't tell Abraham which country it was going to be. But then Abraham must have told Isaac, and Isaac must have told Jacob. And so when Jacob goes into Israel, he remembers the promise of God that his own people will be enslaved. And so when Jacob dies, he tells his children, take me back to the land that was promised to my father, as a sign that his generation, his children and the generations to come will go back there. And then in Genesis chapter 50, verse 24 and 25, Joseph is now about to die. He's 110 years. And then he says, that it's written, then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. Joseph knew of this promise, but he also knew that he's of the first generation of the people who went into Egypt. And so he knew it was not his generation that will be enslaved and be delivered. And so every parent after this, every Israel parent after this, was anticipating the redemption of Israel, even as they went through slavery. And so when it got to the fourth generation, there are some parents who sensed that it was about time for them to be freed from Egypt. And so they valued how God was going to work around this. This is what Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22 to 23 says. It says, by faith Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. And then it goes on to verse 23 and says this. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. In other words, the parents began to see that this is the generation that will receive freedom. Because God has a systematic way of working, and he does his own things in his own way. And so these parents have an inner witness that something is about to happen. Just like we have, and we've been told that Jesus is coming back. And in our inner witness, we know he will come back. And so we receive him by faith, even as we await his coming. And so the Israelites awaited for their freedom. And so as Moses writes this book in chapter 2, as we were looking at last week, he begins to see the things that God is doing as he prepares freedom for his people. We saw how he talks about the people that he brought about because the king of Egypt had ordered that all the children should be killed. And we saw how 2 ladies, Shiphrah and Puah, who were highly placed in the Egyptian society, they oversaw all the Hebrew midwives. How at a policy level and at a political level, they influenced that policy so that the children did not have to be killed. The boys who were born to the Israelites did not have to be killed in the delivery room. And this brings us to that concept of we need to engage wherever God has brought us or has put us. If God has allowed you to influence policy at the best place or the highest places, please do so. If God has called you to influence the nation for him at a political level, do not be afraid. Engage. And for those of us who are citizens of this country, we know there's an election coming next year. We need to engage. We need to take our voters' cards. We need to be ready so that we can influence policy and political direction of this country. Last week I was really happy when I was following up what's happening in Parliament. And I was happy to see some of our young people here last week as they made oral submission on the proposed government, when the government wants to sell 15% of its shareholding in Safaricom. When they were before the National Assembly, the Finance and Planning Committee, and they were making their presentations on what they think about that. You see, they could have just chosen to complain. And I'm talking about our young people here. They could just have chosen to complain. But they did not complain. They engaged. They stepped up. And this is the kind of engagement we are calling ourselves to. Shifra and Puah were not engaging in our church setting the way we are. And even when you'll see Moses being called and taken forward, he's engaging at the place of influence that God has called him. Of course, we'll be happy for you to engage in church. And even this young man, especially one of them that I noticed, he's very active in our community life groups. James, very active. And so you are encouraged as well to participate in the church. We have the team that we commissioned last week here, and they will help you, even as you've been given the QR codes on how to see where to participate. And so we are calling us to be engaged at all levels, like these parents of Moses were. By the time you get to verse 4 of Exodus chapter 2, Moses is looking at his sister. Moses had been born, of course, it was Shifra and Puah when they said that when the influence policy saw that the children are not killed in the delivery room, Moses then survived. When he survived, his mother decided to keep him for 3 more months before and not hand him over to the authorities so that he's drowned in the Nile. And then after that, she took him to the river Nile. And for some reason, either because she was a slave or she couldn't be there all the time, the sister of Moses comes and takes the responsibility to watch over him. It is said his sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket along the reeds and sent her female slaves to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister, that is Moses' sister, asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. You can imagine how brave, how courageous this girl was, how committed she was to her brother and to the family. I don't know what would happen at night. I don't know what would happen during the day when the baby was not yet fed, but she was there for her brother. Yes, we're talking about engagement at the family level. Engagement to help those who need help. Engagement to work together as families. She was there. She was brave, risking her life to go and talk to Pharaoh's daughter with all that security that could have been around her. She could have been arrested. But she also had faith. The mother had impacted faith on her because she believed that Moses was in that generation, the 4th generation that was going to be freed from Egypt. And so she stood firm. She committed herself. She worked hard for the sake of her brother. And you know, when you take a step of faith, the way Moses' mother did, by keeping the baby, and then you take a step of faith like his sister did, by going to ask whether she can go and get the Pharaoh's daughter a Hebrew nurse. It is a step of faith, but it is when you take a step of faith that God takes things from there. Moses' mother taking him to the river, she had no idea what will happen to Moses. The sister going to ask, she had no idea what Pharaoh's daughter would say. But it is when you take a step of faith that then God takes the next step. Sometimes we are fearful and we don't want to engage because we think, what will happen next? We think I'll fail and then I'll be embarrassed or things like that. But this passage teaches us that when God tells us to do something, or when we sense God telling us to do something, he then takes over from there. In fact, the role that the sister of Moses plays is so brief in this passage. She was just watching. And then when Pharaoh's daughter comes, she goes and asks. And when the Pharaoh's daughter says yes, she goes to the mother, the baby's mother, and that is her role. What role is God calling you to today? Be it in your family, be it among your friends. Are you brave enough? Are you courageous enough to take steps of faith? And so from there, what we see is a very interesting process. Because now Pharaoh's daughter, when Moses' mother comes, she says, yes, you take this baby, telling Moses' mother, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. This is a mother who took the baby to the river, expecting the baby to die with no way out, not knowing what will happen. And now here is Pharaoh's daughter, not only giving her baby back to her to nurse the baby, but she's going to be paid for that. Probably she was working as a slave somewhere else without pay, but now she's going to focus only on her daughter, and she'll be paid. Sometimes God does such things in our lives. That's why we don't need to be afraid, because we don't know what God will do. When he takes over, he takes over. And so we are told she took the baby, and when the baby got older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. His life from there is paid and subsidized by the house of the very person who had issued the death sentence for every Hebrew boy to die. How is that for you? The very person who wanted you to die is going to pay for your education, is going to pay for your livelihood. That is our God. We cannot limit him. Moses himself becomes a prince, and we begin to see the challenges that he begins to have. You see, the identity formation process for Moses is very complicated. You know how we find our identities? We find our identities by what we aspire. We all have something. There is something that is the main thing in your life, what you are living for. What is it? What is it that defines you? It could be possessions, or it could be someone. What do we aspire? And Moses is finding himself as a prince in the palace, and he has to ask himself this question: what do I aspire for? And these are things that define our identities. The other question that defines our identity is, what am I worth? And am I reaching to honor that highest good or that accomplishment? Because if I know what I am, what the main thing in my life, and I ask, am I aspiring to get it? Then it tells me my worth. If I'm achieving what I need to achieve to get what I want, or what is the main thing, then I feel I am worth it. But if I fail, I feel I'm not worth it. And Moses has to ask these questions in the palace. The other question that defines our identity is, who gets to say what my worth is? In other words, who gets to evaluate you? What other people say about you? That is your reputation. And Moses has to ask this question: what is my reputation? And identity becomes a crisis for Moses. And identity is a crisis for many of us, because many people may have given us identities depending on our past, our hearts, our complications, our contradictions, our experiences. And these identities begin to shape us. So when you answer these three questions, you have an identity. And every culture has a way of directing its members to form its identity in a particular way. And culture does not ask you or tell you what it is doing. It just says, this is how it is done. It is like a fish in water. Fish doesn't ask, am I in water or not? It's obvious, and it doesn't know it's even in the water, because that's what it has been in all its life. That's what culture does to us. And Moses has been passing through all these people God has provided. And there have been contradictions and there have been conflicts, and he just doesn't understand his identity. How do you get your identity, the core of who you are? Because that helps you to know how to engage. There is what is called the communal identity formation process, And this one is usually outside in. So you go outside and find out something good that affects either the family or the community or the state. And once you find out what that is, you come back in and then you rearrange your life to align yourself with that. And your self-esteem is the honor the community bestows on you because of the sacrifices, the personal sacrifices you make for the higher good of the community or of the family. And so your self-esteem comes from either the family or the community as you sacrifice your self-interest for the greater good. And this is what we see Moses' sister did. She was of the communal identity formation, where you think beyond yourself. Otherwise, how do you explain a young girl spending her evenings, her nights, looking after her brother? And then there is the individualistic identity formation process. And this explains how the Pharaoh's daughter would defy her father and bring a Hebrew child into the palace. In fact, she does not even ask or even or consult, because she's in an identity formation, an individualistic identity formation process. This kind of process, you go inside first, and then you look at your deepest desires, your feelings and your dream, and then you go out and tell everybody, including family, the state or the community or your parents, that they have to make changes and adjustments to accommodate you. And you're the only validator. All the others are not. Because only you can access or assess your own worth and value, your desires and who you are. And so your self-esteem is the dignity you bestow on yourself when you assert who you are against any claims that your family or the state has on you. And so this is the kind of contradictions that Moses finds himself in. He's in a communal identity formation process in his formative years, and then he finds himself in an individualistic community formation process. And this kind of processes, you can find them happening in the same place to people in different classes. And this is exactly what's happening over here. He lives in this world of tensions. He's living in a world of two mothers, one who adopted him and one who is the biological mother. He is a slave child who lives in the palace as a prince. He is an Israelite with an Egyptian name. You know, for those of you who like biographies, the biographer of Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, said this, that he suspects that Steve was so driven and ruthless because he wanted to prove to the world that his parents should not have given him up for adoption. In other words, he had been adopted, and he was trying to prove himself. Moses, on the other hand, seems to have been fighting against the circumstances that made him to leave his biological mother by force in a way or another, and to be adopted out of good grace by Pharaoh's daughter. And so you will see Moses standing up against injustice and tyranny. You will see him kill an Egyptian who was about to kill a Hebrew slave. He refuses to watch as abusers are protected and people prioritizing their reputations and silencing the victims. Moses stands up. And then the next day, he's on the same street. Having buried the guy he killed in the sand, he's on the same street the next day. And even trying to sort out a dispute, not hiding. That's a kind of contradiction that you see Moses living. Eventually, because of these contradictions, he's rejected by the Israelites and he's rejected by the Egyptians. The Egyptians feel he's trying to kill them. And the Israelites feel he's living too much in the palace. He's not one of them. They have been waiting for him to do something, and he's not doing anything. And so in Acts chapter 7, when Steve is writing about Moses, he says this: Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. A man who was educated, trained in military strategy and everything. But when he was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, Moses came upon 2 Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. And so here he is now as a foreigner. Moses' foreignness is not just foreignness. In Egypt, he was already a foreigner. And now he becomes a double foreigner in Midian. In fact, he names his own son to reflect this journey. You know, when you're a foreigner, you have limited privileges. For example, I could not have gone the other week to Uganda to vote because I'm not a Ugandan citizen. He has to change his career when he goes to Midian as a foreigner. In fact, he takes on the very career that in Egypt, in the palace, it was despised completely: a shepherd. And so if Moses would have ever met his friends that they used to be within the palace, it would have been very embarrassing, because now he becomes a shepherd. He even has to change culture and language. And there is all this clash, to the extent that when he was going back now to free his own people, God had to arrest him because he had not even circumcised his sons, according to the way God had told the Hebrews. All these culture clashes and confusion had left Moses almost without an identity, feeling lost and wondering who he is. And so we move to the next point: the presence of God. So this is what then the Lord says from verse 7 of chapter 3. The Lord says, he now comes to Moses, who's been in the foreign land for 40 years. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt, and I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites and Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them." As far as Moses was concerned, he had done his part. The Egyptians had rejected him. The Israelites had rejected him. He's now 80 years old, and it is done. It is over. But not so for God. God says, "I have come down to rescue them. I have come down." That is our God. Our God comes. Our God never leaves us, however long it takes. He shows himself to Moses. And not only does he show himself to Moses, if you're writing it's number 3, the call of God, or God's call to Moses. So after he says, "I have now come, I have seen, I have heard," he says, "I have come." And then now he tells Moses in Exodus chapter 3, verse 10 to 12, "So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." So Moses, if our Moses would be there, I'm thinking, you said you have come down to bring the Israelites out of Egypt, and now you are telling me to go. Doesn't make sense. But you see, this is the joy of God. Not only was he with Moses, he used people and circumstances to bring Moses to where he is. And now he's telling Moses, I am going, but I am going with you. And the burden of engagement is that privilege of you and I partnering with God with what God is already doing. It is no longer the old system where Moses is trying to do his thing, but it is God himself who's come down. Why has he come down? Because what he told Abraham, the time has come. It is God's time. It is the fourth generation. And he has come down. Not earlier, not later. I don't know what circumstances and issues you may be going through, but God's time is never late. He is always there. And so he calls us to engage. So he says, now I'm sending you to Pharaoh. But then Moses asks him a question. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh to bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And this is always a challenge of engagement. Many people ask, who am I? Because maybe the past has told you or taught you that you are a nobody. Maybe the past has been like the past of Moses, where you live in contradictions, or you see contradictions, and you just don't know how to handle it. And so you ask, who am I? And I wonder today, if you're here, and God is calling you to engage in your family, God is calling you to engage at your place of influence, in your school, at your workplace, or even in church. And you're probably feeling like Moses, I'm now a shepherd. If anyone in Egypt asks me what I'm doing, I tell him I'm a shepherd. They will just dismiss me. Maybe you come to church and sit in such a position that you would not want anyone to ever see you even in church, because your past life is such that you would not like anyone to associate you even with church. Or you do that because you know this coming week you're going to steal some money from your office or from your employer. But then God comes and tells him, go, I'm sending you. And you're asking, who am I? And God says this, and this is critical, this is important, as we talk about engagement. God says, I will be with you. That's always God's answer if you have to engage. I will be with you. And as Moses is writing these memoirs, as he's looking at his mother, who had to take a step of faith to protect him and to refuse to give him over to the authorities to be killed, he realizes God was with my mother. He brought Pharaoh's daughter to rescue me. God was there. And so God says, I will be with you. And then he says something else that is very interesting. He says, this will be a sign to you that it is I who has sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. That's Mount Sinai. What kind of sign is this? Because here we are talking about the future. I want a sign that I can use now. But God is telling him that I have called you and I'm faithful enough to the extent that the sign to you is that when you come back, you will worship me on this very mountain that we are talking about, Mount Hero, after he's brought the Israelites out. Because God is doing two things. He's saying because he has said it, it will happen. And then he also gives the reason why Moses has to go and remove the Israelites out of Egypt. Is so that they may worship him. Because the end game of deliverance is not that they be just free from slavery. The worst thing that can ever happen to a people is to be free from slavery, but not free to worship God, because they are enslaved by other idols. They are enslaved spiritually. And so these people are to be free indeed. Spiritually, to be able to worship God, physically from the Egyptians. And so God calls us at the end of the day to worship him. That is the purpose of engagement. And if you don't know the end purpose of why you need to engage, be it at your workplace, be it in your home, be it at your social places, then you miss the point. Because that's why God has sent you there. Moses will later on realize that all his life, God has been preparing him for engagement. And I don't know about you, whether you realize that all those people God has been brought in your life, all those circumstances that God has ever brought into your life, it is so that you engage, and engage in such a way that God's people will not worship you or worship other idols, but they will worship him. That is the purpose of worship. And so when you and I fail to engage, or when you and I feel we are not worthy of engagement, then we deny people, be it children, be it the youth, be it the adults here, we deny people that opportunity to be free and to know God and to worship God the way God wants. Who am I? And so Exodus chapter 3 from verse 13 to 15, when Moses asks the questions, who am I? Because he's struggling with this identity crisis, like I said. God then gives him his name. You see, the only way that you and I can understand who we are is to understand who God is. Because you and I have been created in the image of God. God is the original. And when we understand who God is, then we begin to understand who we are and what we are made to do. And so God reveals himself to him. You see, God is primary and we are secondary. Our identities are derivative from God. You know, sometimes we refuse to engage because we want to be a perfect version of what someone else wants us to be. And maybe all your life you've been shaped to be something you're not. And you've been trying to be something you're not. You're trying to be that perfect daughter or that perfect secretary or that easy girlfriend and useful girlfriend, the useful spouse, so that you'll be lovable, and you exile your real self to the shadow simply because you don't know in whose image you've been made. And you've been operating in other people's images. And so when you're told to engage, you're so afraid of your reputation. What will they say? What will they do? This is how I've been taught. And so you grow up in a system where love is transactional. Because you are allowed, because you behaved like this, you develop a structure to put your real life in a box and shut it. And so you spend your life being a mirror to somebody else. But engaging is when you start understanding who the real maker, creator is for you and who he wants you to be. And that starts when you know who he is. And so Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what will I tell them? Moses is basically asking God, who are you? He's asking the right questions. God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. In other words, God is telling Moses that I have been at work in history. And I am a personal God. I've been relating to your forefathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. And so the name of God reveals his attributes. God is real. He exists. He's not an idol or a myth. He is self-existent. He's not created. He has no beginning or an end. I am. He is constant. He does not change. I am. He is the source of truth, beauty, and goodness. And he is not distant. And that is why he can come to Moses and reveal himself to Moses. You may be here and wondering, if I step up to engage, What will happen to me? In 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 16 to 17, Elisha's servant was so afraid to engage in what God was asking them to engage. And then Elisha prayed and told God to open the eyes of this servant. And when this servant opened their eyes, they saw the angels of the Lord all over. This same God who is calling you to engage says, I will be with you. He is the same God who has come to us in Jesus Christ. In the book of John, as Pastor Malika comes up and they worshipped him, in the book of John, Jesus speaking to the Pharisees, he said, before Abraham was, I am. Before Abraham was, I am. And they understood exactly what Jesus was saying. They picked stones to stone him because Jesus was basically saying he is God. And so if Jesus was not God, these Pharisees were right. They needed to stone him. But he is God. The God who revealed himself to Moses in a burning bush has in our days revealed himself to us in Jesus Christ. When he revealed himself to Moses in the burning bush, Moses had to hide his face. But now he's revealed himself to Jesus through Jesus. Jesus has come to us, to our level, and willing to relate with us. He would have told the Pharisees, before Abraham was, I was. But he said, before Abraham was, I am. The same yesterday, today, and forever. And when you receive him, he does not leave you. He gives us the Holy Spirit. He says, I will be with you. Just like he told Moses. Brothers and sisters, it is time to engage. Moses is reminding us that one of the ways to engage is through gratitude, appreciating the people God has brought into your life to make you who you are in readiness for the engagement he's calling you now. Are you grateful? Are you reaching out to them the way Moses does? Being grateful. The other way is to respond to God by faith.